I want to talk about transitions. And it was interesting at our 9 o'clock service a little while ago under the tent outside. We were gathered for prayer, and there was a big transition going on all around us. Last year's graduates gathered in Mad Bowl, and while we were praying together, they walked across the street so they could walk the lawn. They're last year's graduates, lots of their transitions are behind them, but still, it's a time of transition for them. You could hear that energy, but we could also feel it here. We are in a time of transition. We're in a transition from one thing to another. We don't know what that's going to look like. I got some great advice one time from a preacher on public speaking. He said, always know where you're going to start your sermon. Always know the last line and nail your transitions, he said, because if you don't nail your transitions, you're going to flounder. And you know, I think that was true, not just about public speaking, but it's true for life. These transitions are important. Saying goodbye is difficult under almost any circumstances. Transitioning from one thing to another, from one place to another, from one way of being in relationship to another way of being in relationship. No matter how good, no matter how exciting that new thing might be, these transitions are difficult. They challenge us in lots of different ways. Our lives are constantly changing, right? There is no like one way, static, way that things stay. They're always changing, but there seem to be, over the arc of our lives, these punctuation marks. Some of them are marked by ceremonies like baptism, like a wedding, like a funeral or graduation. And then there are these times that we don't have rituals to mark these things, but they are really important punctuation marks in our lives. A new job, the loss of a job, a divorce, going off to something new experience or some sort of loss, from quarantine to community as we find ourselves now. These transitions touch us. They touch us deeply, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, they touch us. And they often make us feel vulnerable. They make us feel vulnerable and fragile. And when we feel vulnerable and fragile, we don't always know what we're feeling. We don't always know what to do with that. And sometimes that we reach for things that might be familiar ways of acting. It brings up fear or self-doubt or uncertainty, a sense of loss. Even if that thing that we're moving towards, that new world we're going into, that new way of being, even if it's something we really want, even if where we are is not somewhere we want to be anymore, these changes, these transitions can be fraught. I think like many people, that I had to be taught how to do this. This is not something that I think we just learn naturally. And I kind of grew up among wolves, and nobody taught me how to transition from one thing to another. What I saw was you get angry. You have some kind of outburst. You throw some explosives towards one another verbally. And that way you get to deal with the anger. That way you get to deal with the hurt feelings rather than what's really going on inside. Rather than dealing with that vulnerability, that fragility, that sense of loss, the self-doubt. But we can learn it. But how? How do we do this? How do we learn how to take leave? How do we say goodbye? How do we learn how to move from one thing to another, whether it's from college to work, from home to college, from married to single, from single to married, from quarantine to community? How do we make these transitions from what is familiar, from what we know, to things that might be unfamiliar, that we don't know, and that we're uncertain about? Our gospel reading this morning helps us. These last chapters of John's gospel are laden with life, with life-giving words. it's rich territory. I often think of these final chapters of John like a bumblebee in a big sunflower. If you've ever happened to see that, they just kind of swirl around in there and cover themselves in pollen, and they're really sticky from all the nectar. And it's almost like they are intoxicated with all of this life-giving material. And John's gospel is a lot like that. And so we have to kind of remember the trajectory of what's the overall arc of the story so that we can fly. And the overall arc of the story is that Jesus is saying goodbye. He's saying goodbye to his friends. He knows that this is a big transition that's going to begin within just hours. They're going to move from one way of being together into a totally new way of being together. He's going to move into a new relationship with them, with his God. It's all in flux, it's all moving. And he tells them how it's going to look. He tells them, here's how you can act in this. Here's what's really important. Here's some of the things that have happened among us. Remember these things. And then he prays for them. And that's where we listen in John chapter 17. He prays for them. And what he prays for them is that they might have joy, that they might know a deep, abiding joy that comes from being in relationship. Even when those relationships are changing, even when they are new, even when they need to become new, he says may they find this joy in what we've had together. And remember, these relationships weren't always easy. There were lots of hard things that they had to learn together, but he wants them to find joy in what has been, to find joy in what is, and then move into that new thing. His relationship with his friends is going through a fundamental shift. He probably doesn't know what that's going to look like. His friends don't know. But he believes that there is a joy that comes from the spiritual life that transcends our immediate circumstances. It transcends those circumstances, but when we tap into that joy, it changes our circumstances. At least it changes the way we view them. And that joy, the way we tap into that joy is through gratitude. Gratitude for what has been, gratitude for what is and what might be. The other thing he does in this prayer is that he entrusts his friends to God. He entrusts his own life to God. He entrusts his friends, his relationships with them to God. He entrusts the future to God. So often in these times of transition, we want to fix it. We want to make the outcome what we envision. Sometimes we're working from fear. Sometimes we're actually working from hope. We want to see a particular reality take shape. And what Jesus says here is there's a limit to our control. There's a limit to our ability to change things, to change people. And oftentimes we cross that limit without ever knowing that we've done it until it's too late. But he says, entrust all of your life. Entrust one another to God, because God is going to be at work in our lives, doing more than we can ask or imagine. Our futures are not up to us, they are up to God. It may be some of the hardest work we ever do to entrust ourselves, our friends, our loved ones, our children, our future to God. And it often, these opportunities to entrust them to God and to trust God come at the most inconvenient times. But that seems to be where we live. That's how we cross the threshold into a new life. Taking leave with joy, saying goodbye with trust, is a deeply spiritual act.